Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. Mauricio Pochettino is set to be the new head coach of the US men's national team. The Argentine takes charge less than 2 years out from co-hosting the World Cup. So, is Pochettino the right choice to turn around US fortunes into an American dream? I'm joined by the Athletic's Adam Crafton and Felipe Cardenas. At the time of recording, though, we're still awaiting official confirmation, but essentially, we feel this deal is signed and sealed. But Adam, we spoke about this on The Athletic, I think, maybe 3 weeks ago. We thought this news was going to land much earlier. What has been the delay?
I was going to say, I feel like we've done this conversation
right.
already, but bear with us because there's so much more to tell. The delay has been that Pochettino left Chelsea in the summer, obviously at the end of the season, if we can remember. There was that end of season review where Chelsea decided with Pochettino or without Pochettino that the best way forward would be without him and then to move on to Enzo Maresca. And part of the delay has just been there is a sizable difference between what a national team is able to pay a coach of Pochettino's standing and what a club like Chelsea would have been paying Pochettino. Now, Pochettino still had a period of time left on his contract at Chelsea when he left the club. So I think it was another year that he had on that deal. So there was a kind of, if he wouldn't have taken a job, then Chelsea would have had to pay him up fully, I think, until the end of that contract. Now, because he took a job, that situation started to change a little bit, but there was still going to be a discrepancy between what he would earn as the US national team manager and what he would have earned had he just continued being out of work but being paid up by Chelsea. So that was what was being negotiated, that difference to make sure that Pochettino essentially wasn't out of pocket or close to not being out of pocket, but also in a way that was acceptable to Chelsea. But, you know, as I think has started to emerge over the last few days, getting things done at Chelsea at the moment with the ownership situation there, where you have a set of owners barely speaking to one another, is not necessarily the easiest thing. And I think there was also a lot of emotion involved in Pochettino's exit as well. So it's almost like going straight from the divorce, Pochettino and Chelsea, into let's deal with the financials of trying to sort out a settlement. So I think that's what's been the delay. There's been a few other kind of minor issues just between Pochettino and US soccer to thrash out. But, you know, ultimately the September camp is never that important, you know, in the grand scheme of things. There was this kind of awkward banana skin game where the US were playing Canada this weekend against Jesse Marsch, someone who almost certainly would have loved at certain points to be the US national team manager, which Canada won. But it wasn't like it would have been a nice to have Pochettino in place rather than, you know, a deal breaker. So I think it was a case of just getting the deal over the line.
Yeah, Felipe, look, we know Mauricio Pochettino over here for the Premier League, and Argentines know him very, very well. How was this news greeted by US soccer fans?
I think what's interesting and important to note is that the reason why American soccer fans are excited about Mauricio Pochettino is because he has coached his entire career in Europe. And that has such cachet among the American football fan base. If you remember, here the Premier League and everything that has to do with exporting players to Europe, and this current national team is a young team that the majority play in Europe, and that really gets the American fans excited because for them they see it as a development. We finally have players that are playing in Europe, and Greg Berhalter, the former coach, who really did divide the fan base. He made his life in Major League Soccer. He was a very well-respected coach for the Columbus Crew from 2013 to 2018. At the time, he was both the coach and the sporting director, so he understood how to build teams, how to recruit players, and he had a style of play and everything that I think most fans would appreciate. But the fact that he came from Major League Soccer straight to the national team, I think it allowed him to. I'll say this: there were certain fans that just never accepted him, honestly, because they didn't see it as a strong enough resume to coach the national team. So Mauricio Pochettino, remember there was like 48 hours where Rino Matarazzo, the American coach in Germany, coaching Hoffenheim, was reported to be close or at least negotiating or talking to U.S. Soccer, and U.S. Soccer Twitter just blew up. It was like, fine, sign it, get him, give him the job. This is a coach that has an American passport. He has made his career in Europe, so he brings that experience to the national team. And then what was reported was, essentially he's angling for a new deal with Hoffenheim, and that name goes away. And then suddenly Mauricio Pochettino's name starts to pop up. And this is after fans were clamoring for Jurgen Klopp. We throw the money at him and do anything to get Klopp. And so I think Pochettino, in the grand scheme of things, you have to admit, he wasn't the top choice. Now he is a massive, massive name, and that has the American fan base excited. But I think we're going to find out who else they spoke to and where Pochettino was in the pecking order. But now he's the man. He's the name that the American fan base believes in. And I'll just go back to what Adam said. This friendly against Canada, it's true. Most September camps during a FIFA window, and especially now moving forward, they're not going to be meaningful games for the United States. They don't have World Cup qualifiers. They're just friendlies. But this game against Canada, in Kansas City, it was a 2-1 loss for the United States, and Canada just outplayed them. They out-hustled them. They had more heart. They had more spirit. And that suddenly became this, I think, a point of contention among the fan base as well. Can Mauricio Pochettino, is he, aside from his resume, the man to actually inspire this team to play to a level that they are expected to play at? So I think that's the first hurdle that Pochettino has to get over. Can he convince the fan base that he's the guy, to get this team to actually play up to their expectations?
Yeah, I want to go into that a bit more because, 2 years isn't a long time to get this team up to speed. But for more on how Pochettino's appointment has been received, here's the Athletics' Paul Tenorio.
The arrival of Mauricio Pochettino could not have come soon enough for this team. I mean, the U.S. is coming off of the massive disappointment of being eliminated in the group stage of the Copa America. Then this weekend, they followed that with this dismal performance in a 2-1 loss to Canada on Saturday, where they just looked slow. They looked unenergetic. They looked like they didn't care. This is a team that looks like it very much needs a reset. Pochettino immediately becomes the highest profile manager in the history of this program. And he also is a voice. He's known for being a man manager. He knows how to motivate players. That's what he did so well at Southampton. It's what he did at Spurs. Obviously, the job was a little bit different at PSG, but even last season at Chelsea, I think you saw his ability to get more out of a group, especially late in the season after Christmas. And so now his arrival brings hope back to the program and belief. He's the face of this team now. He is the biggest name, I think, globally, certainly affiliated with this program. I think in the United States, maybe the recognition would be only behind Christian Pulisic, and he's got a chance to now take this team and turn it into something special. That's the task. Can you do something different with the U.S. men's national team that's never been done before when they host a World Cup in 2 years' time?
On a commercial level, a name like Pochettino for the U.S. men's national team leading up to a World Cup, getting people behind this team, getting people behind soccer, it's surely a win-win.
It is, because he's, those of you in the UK have followed him and seen him grow as a manager and everything from the English language. I think he showed up in England and his English was very limited, and now he can communicate in both languages, English and Spanish. He's the first South American to coach the U.S. men's national team as well. And so commercially, to your point, that that's going to be very important, because the U.S. Latino fan base in the U.S. is one of the most commercially attractive demographics in I think in any industry here in the most capitalist country in the world, and from a sporting perspective, they continue to be a very attractive one, and especially for U.S. soccer, they are very attractive. But who can connect with them? And so Pochettino is going to have a role here to try to bridge that gap between the Latino fan base here in the U.S. that are bicultural and that may support the national teams of their grandparents or of their parents, and try to bring this bring the U.S. men's national team to them, and perhaps a voice like Pochettino can do that. But I think it's interesting here that the star of the team now is going to be the manager. And what does that mean? Is that a good thing? Does that put too much on the manager? When the US men's national team, the players for the last 4 years have been touted as a golden generation, and now they're seen as a team of underperformers, of underachievers. And so, where's the rub here? Where's the balance going to be? So that's something that I'm interested in seeing. And just the last thing I'll say, about that last friendly in Canada against Canada and Kansas City, I reported the week of August 26th that U.S. Soccer expected Pochettino to be in Kansas City. They wanted him to be there. They didn't think he would coach on the sideline, but he was going to be heavily involved, him and his staff, working with the players, meeting with the players on the ground, starting this relationship during this friendly against Canada. And obviously that didn't happen. So that tells you everything about what Adam was referring to before, how, the deal just hasn't been able to get across the line. And what I was told that week was, the week of the 27th leading up to that game in Kansas City is going to be very important. And clearly, the T's weren't crossed and the I's weren't dotted yet. And that's why we're still now at a point where here, the American media, the American fan base is starting to get worried. Time is running out. They don't have time to waste.
I think the big thing with US soccer at the moment, with the US Soccer Federation at the moment, is how can they make people as engaged, invested, connected to this team as the country appears to be with their women's team, right? Because I think that's a real challenge for them at the moment. I think there's I know there's a big difference between tournaments and kind of the odd friendly game, but the attendance for the game against Canada on Saturday night, just over 10,000, right? And we can talk about all different things about, the team not being so strong and, the price of tickets and the way the tickets were marketed and all of this kind of stuff.
The opponent as well.
The opponent.
Big opponent.
The opponent. But actually, the story of football all over the world, right, is that when people care, when people are connected, kind of almost regardless of price and ease and journeys and all of that kind of thing, people find a way to get there because they care about it, right? And that has to be the aim for US soccer. You can't have games where the first team in what could have, as Felipe was saying, Pochettino could have been there. On Saturday night, and maybe people buy tickets closer to the game than in other countries over here. But in any case, it was a game against Jesse Marsh. It was a bit of a grudge match coming off the back of the Copper. I mean, it just surprises me consistently, how low some of these attendances are. So it doesn't surprise me that they've gone high profile in the search for a manager. And I think it is about more than the World Cup. It is about trying to grow the connection with the team, with the sport, get some more stardust. Felipe mentioned Jurgen Klopp. There were discussions with Jurgen Klopp. It wasn't just a kind of, I suppose fans on social media saying, let's try and get Klopp. US soccer tried. And Klopp, I think at this stage, isn't ready to come back to football. If that conversation had happened a year later, perhaps, it may well have been different, actually. Because I think they had some positive feedback in some of those discussions. Pep Guardiola was another person that they went for. The list of people that they went for, it wasn't a kind. I think there was quite a bit of reporting early on that was kind of around coaches that we would more consider as MLS coaches. So Steve Cherundolo and Wilfred Nancy. Felipe, who was the guy in Germany, the American-born guy?
Rino Matarazzo.
Rino Matarazzo. But I think genuinely US soccer had a really ambitious set of targets.
And all European-based. That's what I'm saying. They were they were focused on getting a European-based coach with that experience. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I think you'll get some quite nativist approaches about Pochettino. I think Pochettino will almost certainly split his time pretty significantly between Europe and living in the States. I think he'll have a place out here, but I think he'll spend the bulk of his time probably in Europe, which makes sense because most of his best players are there, right? So if he wants to get to know these players and observe these players, it doesn't really make sense for him to be sitting in Chicago, Atlanta for most of his time, or, you know, going around primary schools, elementary schools, you know, doing photo ops. He's got to do a bit of that, but ultimately he needs to be where the players are. So I don't think that's as big a deal as it maybe would have been, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think there has to be a kind of a mature approach to some of this stuff. I think the other bits that, you know, that was significant in terms of getting Pochettino over the line, he clearly has a pre-existing relationship with the US sporting director, Matt Crocker, who he's crossed over a year with at Southampton. So I think that probably helped things. And I think Matt Crocker probably needed this, to be honest. You know, he wasn't particularly visible during Copa America, where things went pretty badly. Felipe, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he's done much media really at all, has he?
He hasn't done much media, and you know, I think the fans were starting to point at him as the decision maker that decided to bring back Greg Berhalter. So after the 2022 World Cup, and the blow up between Gio Reyna, his parents, and Greg Berhalter, that was an absolute fiasco here in the United States, and there was a bit of an interview process to see if they wanted to retain Greg Berhalter. They interviewed other candidates, and ultimately they decided to bring back Greg Berhalter. And that, like I said, Berhalter divides the fan base, and so a lot of the fan base after the World Cup were ready to move on, and then Crocker is essentially the one that fans pointed to as, you know, the person saying, okay, we're going to stick with Berhalter and through this summer of 2024, and then earmarking the summer as a very significant one for the men's national team. So, you know, to his credit, then they, you know, together with Cindy Parler-Cohn, you know, the U.S. soccer president, you know, they make this decision to move on from Berhalter, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, and I think if you kind of move that on, I think it's a really interesting moment as well for US soccer, because I think their view now is that this isn't a one-off, right? In terms of this profile of coach, like when I speak to people there, they don't want this to just be, or at least they say they don't just want this to just be a one-off appointment for a World Cup, and then we go back to coaches who are developed through MLS. Unless MLS, you know, really kicks on a few levels, and that level of coach or the level of player in MLS increases significantly, I think, you know, this is what they want the US national team to be from now on, you know, a desirable job for the most in-demand coaches in the world. And, you know, if you want a reflection of the way that Chelsea, despite deciding that he can leave, held Pochettino, well, you know, when he left Chelsea, there was a 6-month period put in which he couldn't join another Big 7 Premier League club. We include Newcastle now in that kind of 7th place, which may be a bit unfair on Aston Villa, given that they actually finished 4th. But that shows, you know, the standing that he was held in. I think there would have had to be a sizable payout. And I think also the other thing that's, you know, pretty important to point out is I think Pochettino's agreement with the US is also going to be pretty well protected. In terms of making sure he's actually here by the time the World Cup comes around, right? You know, because actually even during this little lull, this little period over the last 2 or 3 weeks where things haven't happened, well, look what's happened in the Premier League. Manchester United have lost 2 games. United have spoken to Pochettino so many times over the years, it's almost incredible that that's never happened. Newcastle's situation between, you know, Paul Mitchell, the sporting director there, who's worked with Pochettino before at Spurs, and Eddie Howe is pretty fractured. You know, I started to wonder, could Pochettino just hold out, right? Could he hold out for one of those jobs, you know, that may become available in November, December? But I think ultimately the change of pace as well is what has appealed to Pochettino. And also, you know, the possibility to shape the direction of a national team structure. I think he has spoken in his interviews with real enthusiasm about, both himself and Jesus Perez, his assistant, you know, who was almost described, you know, Pochettino's the CEO, Jesus Perez is the COO, right? In that coaching structure, you know, you'll never see them separate, you know, working separately. You'll always see them together at a press conference. They're really, really tight. Perez is historically a kind of a fitness coach, but I think he's become more tactical over time. Really smart guy. So that I think some of those elements have just played in. And then just to go back to that point about, being part of that Latin influence, I think economically that was really important as well, just from a sponsorship point of view for US soccer. You're trying to hit both markets at the same time. You've got a World Cup that's taking place. Obviously, Pochettino is not Mexican, but you have a World Cup that is taking place both in the US, Mexico, and Canada. So it's a North American World Cup. It is cutting across all of these different touch points. And I think Pochettino being able to speak to more than one audience is important.
Yeah, Felipe, just very quickly, just something that Adam spoke about earlier as well, and I really want to touch on this because I didn't really make that connection. Is that comparison between how the women's team and the men's team are followed in US soccer? I was looking at Alex Morgan, who's recently announced a retirement. Look, this is a double World Cup winner. This is a, CONCACAF medal winner. This is an Olympic gold medalist, a bronze medalist. Is there a difference in how, I guess, the PR is around the women's team versus the men's team, because the women's team have been incredibly successful?
Well, you mentioned it. There's no gold medal to talk of for the men's side. There's no World Cup. The women's team, they are revered, they are adored, and that's been the case since the '91 World Cup. That very important World Cup for the women's game. And since then, the United States women have been a team that it's almost like it looks like two different, I think, attractions. Like the men's team, if before a World Cup, they sort of drum up excitement and support. But the women's team feels like a national team that really is ingrained in the society of American sports, which is very difficult to do for a soccer team, for a national team. And that's something that I think the U.S. men have always been chasing, and it comes from results. We can sit here and debate about the women's game and the men's game, but the women's national team, the U.S. women's national team, have consistently been considered championship contenders, and that's what draws an American audience to a team. Do you win? Do you win consistently? And they do, and the men don't. And so that is why there's such a disparity in support between these two national teams.
Felipe, do you think there's something as well, the biggest US sports, when you think of NFL and baseball and NBA, kind of outside, okay, with basketball, obviously you have the Olympics, but outside of that, there isn't really international sport in America. The World Series is America, right? International sport isn't really a thing outside of the Olympics in quite the same way.
Exactly.
As in Europe, as in South America. And therefore that kind of, so if you're, I don't know, a team like a nation such, who shall I offend? Scotland, Wales, Republic of Ireland, right? Nations that don't win, right?
Yeah.
They don't win. England don't win, right? But you have a presumed audience, a presumed support. It's just you turn up, you watch, because you kind of have to, because that's the culture. Whereas here, it just doesn't quite feel like Americans necessarily always get the international sport. Do you think that's unfair?
I think it's definitely something to talk about. 10,000, maybe 10,000 went to this game in Kansas City, Canada, the United States. Well, down the road, just across the way, 2 nights later, a raucous sellout, 70,000 people went to watch the Kansas City Chiefs, the Super Bowl champions, against the Baltimore Ravens. That's probably what the focus was throughout that state. That's the opening weekend of the NFL calendar. Took place during the same weekend of this friendly between the United States and Canada. So they were U.S. soccer is completely overshadowed by what is the most popular sport in the United States, which is American football. But I do agree. I think in other countries, your national team means so much to you, even if you're not a perennial winner. You're there. You're there in the worst of times, and you're there when you happen to win. And I think for the U.S. men, they haven't always had that type of support. Period.
Yeah, Adam. Felipe talks about how obviously American football holds much bigger attraction to American fans, but Pochettino's now got only a couple of years to turn this around. And you spoke about perhaps he could have waited out for another another appointment in Europe maybe, or another Premier League team perhaps, but do you think he will be able to do what he can do? We know him as a motivator of men, we know him as a great tactician, all those kind of things. Do you think you'll be able to do that when you don't spend week in, week out with these players and then having to do it in a matter of 2 years so they can actually perform at the biggest global stage in football?
On Saturday night, Kansas City Current, which is the NWSL team, played the Utah Royals. They had, I mean, first of all, they were playing on the same night, right, as the US men's national team. They got a bigger audience. They got a bigger crowd, right?
Than the friendly.
No, it was a league game.
A league match.
League game.
No, than the friendly, the US
Than
friendly.
the friendly. But they got over 11,000 in that game. So, you know, I think that's the other challenge, that there is a lot of competition for tickets and for tickets and eyeballs, and I think MLS played this weekend, right, as well.
They did,
right?
But Adam, also remember the women. They just won the gold medal at the Olympics,
exactly.
so there is a momentum.
There's a momentum
sure.
there. That's it, exactly.
Yeah. Right, but what I'm saying is, it would be unusual in other markets around the world, and this isn't good or bad, to see a women's club team get a bigger audience than the men's national team. And some people say that's a huge triumph, right? And Kansas Current are one of the best NWSL teams, but it's a striking, notable statistic on this weekend. To go back to your question on Pochettino and how's it going to work with the limited time, I don't know. Ultimately, it's so difficult to know, right? He's never been a national team manager. I'm pretty sure he will, lean on the influence. We know that he's got a decent relationship with Marcelo Bielsa, who obviously he came through under as a player, but he also, he is someone who spends a lot of time, actually, even with his clubs. It takes him a bit of time to get things right. That's been the pattern at Tottenham. It wasn't immediate, right? It took time. I think my colleague Jack Pitt-Brooke always talks about a game at Aston Villa away about 10 or 11 games in, where Spurs were looking like pretty ropey and then came back to win 2-1, and from there it took off. But that's 10 or 11 games. 10 or 11 games, you're almost at the World Cup, right?
It's true.
Right?
It's true.
So I think that's going to be a challenge. I think what I would say is, if you go to any therapy session, they'll always say, to make progress, you need to hit rock bottom. Well, after Copper and losing 2-1 against Jesse Marsh's Canada, in front of 10,000 people, I think that's rock bottom. I think there was a feeling after the Copper, I remember being in the mix zone after the Uruguay game when they went out at the group stage and speaking to a few of the players. I remember Weston McKennie not criticising, but no one was really criticising Berhalter, but there were these hints that it's all a bit comfortable. It's all a bit nice. It's all a bit, we go to camp, we play with these guys that we grew up playing together with, and Greg's pretty good to us, and he's given us all a chance, and he's brought us through. Okay, now you're going to get someone that wants to do more, right? And maybe that's a bit unfair on Berhalter, because actually, you look at what they did at the World Cup, it was decent. It was a decent return. And, the way they played against England, I think one of the challenges he has is the team, right? That's one of the big challenges he has is how
We've
good
got to
are
talk
these?
about the team.
You've got to talk about the team, right? We could talk
we'll
about
definitely come on to that in a bit. Yeah, I'd love to get more into that. Yeah,
like how good is this team really? How many of these players, if you're making a list of the top 100 players in the world, are actually getting into that? Even when I talk about Christian Pulisic, is he in the top 10 wingers in the world?
Depends on who you ask. Honestly,
it depends on who you ask. Exactly.
I don't think I would.
I don't
put
think
him
he
there,
is.
Honestly,
I don't think.
No, I wouldn't put him there.
I was trying to be diplomatic, but I'd probably say no.
He's not starting. Do you think he's starting for a team that's in the Champions League quarterfinals? If the teams that we presume would get to the Champions League quarterfinals get there,
like a Real Madrid, like an Arsenal, like a
Man City,
Man City, yeah,
Bayern Munich, right? So that's not to criticise him. It's just to, but if this is the guy that's like the poster boy and the guy that everyone's leaning out to, he's good. But, when we talk about golden generation, you have to remember he's relative. It's relative to what came before from a US perspective. It's not golden generation from to be biased to England here, a David Beckham, Paul Scholes, Michael Owen, Wayne Rooney, players that at the time would have got into most teams in the world.
It's tricky. It's tricky because you already mentioned that it has taken Pochettino time to really find his footing at these clubs, and where the stakes are much higher than what he's going to face here in the United States. I mean, obviously the stakes are really high now because they're hosting the next World Cup, but it is interesting to see how that'll go because listen, the U.S. soccer, they live in their own bubble. Perhaps you can say that about other national teams, but right now, specifically with the men and this so-called golden generation, and they were one of the youngest teams at the last World Cup. So many players in Europe, that really got the American fan base, the punditry, to really report on a team. I think to elevate their expectations in a way that was a bit unfair. We've already talked about the U.S. not having a history of winning at the international level, and suddenly there was this expectation that this team, because they play in Europe, the players play in Europe, well, they're going to walk onto the pitch and play England or Colombia or Brazil and be at the same level. And that's just not the case. And so, I'm very intrigued to see how Pochettino manages to establish an identity. This team doesn't have an identity. They think they do, because they play out of the back and they play on the ground, and they, it's a 4-3-3 and it's very intricate and et cetera. But then to Adam's point, Canada came in and just out hustled them, outran them. They wanted it more. They got stuck in. And that has really rankled the fan base here in the US, because that was the way the United States used to play. That's how they would, elevate their form against the top teams, of just outplaying them, from a physical perspective, from a mentality perspective. And so right now, these players, they've gone from golden generation to spoiled, soft, uninspired. And that is a huge task for Mauricio Pochettino, to establish a culture. And I am interested to see if his culture, if he can mix the culture that he originated from, which is Newell's Old Boys, where Bielsa was, a team that has a fan base in Argentina that is devout, and they live and breathe and bleed the colors of Newell's Old Boys, but they're not a perennial top of the table team in Argentina either. They had to fight, scrap. Some of the most famous pictures of Pochettino as a Newell's Old Boys defender is the one where he's getting up off the ground, his shirt is torn down the middle, dirt on his face. And that, he was a teenager that rose up and played against some of the better players in the 90s. Is he going to be able to instill that type of culture within a national team, where they believe that, they're not the favorites, and they're going to have to elevate their play and their form. So that, and tactically too, can he do something that allows the United States to play against the best teams in the world and not get played off the pitch? That 5-1 loss to Colombia before the Copa America. Speaking of the bubble, I have friends in Colombia that are watching that game, and they start texting me like, I thought the US was a lot better. Like, what happened? And meanwhile, here in the US, it's like, we've got this team, we've got these players, they're in the Europe, and no, the rest of the world suddenly feels like the United States has taken a big step backwards. So that's going to be a big one, big task for Poch.
What's fascinating is you've just had a coach on the women's side come in and make the most immediate spectacular impact. Right, pick up the pieces.
The Emma Hayes
right?
The part of that equation for Emma Hayes is very significant. To your point, Adam.
Right. So you've got someone who's picked up, the ruins of a previous tournament. In terms of a really disappointing World Cup. Obviously, the quality level of the US women's team is in a different stratosphere, to be honest, to the men's team. But I think it's still a comparison that will make things a little tricky for Pochettino, when he's saying, I need time, because he will say that, and he's right to say that because it's normal. But she's kind of just subverted that by breezing in on the back of a long season with Chelsea, and won a gold medal at the Olympics, and really incredible. So that's a challenge. because there is a direct comparison of an immediate impact. What I would say on the quality point is, as a counterpoint is, if you are well organised and motivated as an international side at a tournament.
That's what I was going to ask you, yeah. It's not foreseeable that they go beyond the group stages. Not all-star teams do well in the World Cups. Or
look at teams like Croatia. I know Croatia had some incredible players over the past few years, but look at teams like Croatia, Morocco, Greece more historically. There's countless examples of this. Even kind of Colombia, Uruguay to a certain extent in the last Copa. There is the possibility there that with the right culture, the right England in 2018, England's team in 2018 was not a strong team. You can go quite far, and I think the other thing that will help the US and maybe buy them some time at the World Cup in 26 is the size of the tournament, right? You're going to have to be pretty bad to go out in the group stage, right? Right? They might do it. I really hope they don't, because it'd be rubbish for business. But if they did, they'd have to be absolutely terrible, right? So I think that will help, right? Like I'd be amazed if they aren't in a knockout stage, right, of that tournament. And I'd probably expect them to get to the second knockout stage, unless they draw against Brazil or something like that. So I think that will help. And I think Pochettino probably recognises that as well, that it's quite hard to fail spectacularly at this upcoming World Cup, right, because of the new format. But it's just like, what's success, right?
But Adam, also I also don't think Pochettino is going to stay past the 2026 World Cup. I'm sorry, even if they get to a semi-final.
How far did they want to take Pochettino? Was he got his eye on a European job? If a big one comes up,
let's get him to the 26 World Cup first.
I mean, but the fact that U.S. Soccer, I hear it. I hear them, and they don't want this hire to be a one-off, and they want to establish. I think a level of experience at that position, but I just don't see Pochettino staying past 2026. Like, even if they, whether they do poorly or do spectacularly well, he's gone. He's going to have way too many options back at the Champions League level to say no and to stay in the United States and become the manager for the next cycle. It's just, I don't see that happening.
So you're saying American fans just get used to the fact that Pochettino is here for another couple of years and we might not ever see him again? Because surely that breaks the bubble. Surely that breaks the dream.
I think so. And it's because of the timing of this hire. That's it. You're 2 years away from a World Cup that you're hosting. If we were to go back in time and we're preparing for Qatar, 2022, and the expectations for that U.S. team in 2022 were like, let's see how they do. They're young. They're going to be the youngest team at the World Cup. We have outside of the United States, nobody knew Greg Berhalter. So I actually felt like those things were working in their favor because the expectations weren't very high, and all they could do was impress. So if you would have brought in a Pochettino then, we might be talking about something entirely different. We potentially would be talking about the culture that he established and the runway that he is going to be on. But now it really does feel like, okay, we need a big coach. We need a good, recognizable name. We need to hit on all these touch points before we host the World Cup. And by the way, we also have to play well. I just think it's a lot to ask a staff to take on and to say, yes, we're your team for, through 2030. I don't see it.
Okay, gents, thank you so much for your time. Really interesting discussion, Adam, Felipe. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, remember you can leave a rating or review wherever you have listened. We'll be back tomorrow discussing the biggest footballing story of the day. Appreciate you listening. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.